So without further ado, let's begin. Would you go to the next slide, please? So to start this, I'd like to leave you with a couple of ideas before we move into our first presentation. The first one is that we have seen in the past few weeks, this year, a lot more net zero declarations emerging. Let's say a lot more governments turning their attention towards the need to reach net zero by 2050 or even earlier, as we would say. This is a reality that is impacting the energy sector. And let's take a look at just some of the rough figures. If we see the amount of carbon dioxide emissions, the countries and regions that have already declared net zero ambitions by 2050 at the latest cover almost half of the CO2 emissions in the world today. There is also November 3rd today an election going on in a certain part of the world, some of you may be aware of. And if we factor in the outcome of this election to the results, if one of these candidates is elected and follows through on their pledge for net zero, then we would actually be covering around 62 of the world's carbon dioxide emissions that now fall under the jurisdiction of these pledges. So this is very significant. We also see the ambition of governments, whether national or even local, for reaching higher shares of renewable energy in the power sector. This is something that really indicates that a profound shift is underway. And these policies, would you switch to the next slide, please? These policies and these ambitions have a real impact on the use of renewable energy in the power sector. We've seen that in 2019, we reached over 27% of renewables in electricity. You may have heard during this crisis of this year, with electricity demand dropping, that even higher shares of renewables were reached in many different countries. This is obviously very significant for the role of what we call variable renewable energies, so solar PV and wind power, and the fact that they may account for around 8%, 9% of the electricity we use today, but this is growing from less than around 1% a decade ago. This is something that's changing rapidly, and one of the main considerations we need to take into account is the way that we transmit this electricity. So would you move to the next slide, please? This is the focus of the workshop today. We want to talk about why we need power grids to help achieve this transition, and also what is the role of civil society in making sure that when we develop these grids in a way that supports the energy transition and the development, the uptake of more renewable energy. So I will leave it at that for me today. Actually, I'll just go to the next slide and take a quick look at the agenda for today to introduce to you our exciting lineup of speakers. So first we'll be starting with an overview of the role of infrastructure and the importance of collaborative planning. And then we'll be taking a look at some success stories that we have been involved in with the PAC project. And then we'll look at some case studies. So from Australia, from Chile, and then also from Europe, to give us a sense for how stakeholder engagement is being dealt with by these energy system planners. Finally, as I mentioned in the beginning to the introduction to this session, we will give you the opportunity to speak directly to our speakers, to share your experiences on what is going on in your context on this topic, and to have a lively and exciting discussion for around 25 minutes, half an hour, before we wrap up in the end. So without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Antina Sander, who is the Deputy CEO of the Renewables Grid Initiative, and she's going to tell us all about the importance of infrastructure and what collaborative planning can do for that development.
Very true. And now I also have found my unmute button. Thanks a lot, Duncan, for the introduction. My name is Antina Sander. My organization is called the Renewables Grid Initiative, and the session is on the role of infrastructure and the importance of collaborative planning. Assuming that several of you do not know what RGI, the Renewables Grid Initiative, is about, next slide, please. This is it in many logos. What you see on the left-hand side is logos of European transmission system operators for electricity. What you see on the right-hand side is logos of NGOs that are either umbrella NGOs for the European level or NGOs active in specific European countries, all of them with a focus either or and on climate and nature protection. This group, growing over the years, has been established in 2009, and the idea has always been and still is, how do we get the power lines built which are needed to allow for an increasing share of renewables, and how do we do this respecting environment and respecting concerns of society. Next slide, please. My three main messages that I would like you to take home today is, first, if we think about very high shares of renewables, we need to think about infrastructure planning and especially grids. Second, scenario development, which is the starting point to, in the end, build grids, has to be ambitious, and it has to be a collaborative exercise of a multitude of different stakeholders. And third, one of these stakeholders, a very important one, is civil society. Civil society has to be involved in scenario development and infrastructure planning if we are serious about the energy transition. Please move on. So the first message, why do we have to think about grids if we want to reach really high shares of renewables? Next slide, please. I'm going to tell the story from a European background. The Renewables Grid Initiative is, as just said, a European organization. But please listen to this having in the back of your head that this can be transferred, the thoughts behind this can be transferred to many parts of the world, to many different geographies. What you see here is that in Europe, the new investment, the investment in new generation primarily goes into variable renewables. On this pie chart, what is yellow is solar PV, what is blue is wind. So you can see where the money goes put by the investors is variable renewables. And indeed, next slide, please. This chart is from the latest Global Status Report of REN21. It shows the 10 countries where, on average, in 2019, more than 20% of electricity came from variable renewables. 7 of the countries are European countries. So that gives you a taste of what is going on here with regards to renewable increase in the system. And next slide, please. There is also some further encouraging achievements and also ambitions. I picked a few just to give you a bit of a taste. For example, in the United Kingdom, in the first quarter of 2020, 47% of electricity came from renewables. That's about twice as high as the bar that was shown on the previous slide. Portugal reported this summer that the country had run for 52 days in a row without using any electricity from coal power plants, which was a new record. There had been previous records, but 52 days was new. And on the outlook side, the government of Ireland, for example, has announced that by 2030, they would like to generate 70% of their electricity from renewables. And 50 Hertz, which is one of the German transmission system operators, in September published a press release saying, actually, by 2032, we would like to be 100% renewables. So there's quite a bit of renewable increase going on in Europe. Now we slowly start to do the transition to what this has to do with grids. Next slide, please. This is all the European countries. Each bar is a country. It doesn't really matter which is which. What you see by the colors is that the generation profiles in different countries vary significantly. Again, yellow solar, blue is wind, green is hydro, and the rest is other things. But the important message is every country has its own generation profile. And these can be complementary, and this is important. I just said I will come to grids. Now I come to grids. Of course, you can move to the next slide. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, there's variation. And if you have different profiles or you have different weather zones, a grid can help you to smooth out this variable generation. The wind is blowing somewhere, but the sun is not shining somewhere else. The grid connects you and you can transport electricity from the place where there is abundance to the place where there is scarcity in this moment. What is the useful thing to do is the grid. Also in those places where you already have high concentration of renewable plants, even though this is foreseeable, it doesn't come unexpected, But in any case, you will have moments where there is very rapid changes in generation because the weather all of a sudden changes. There's a steep increase, a lot of wind, then it drops for whichever reason, and there is a steep decrease. And again, in such situations, the grid can help to balance this out by connecting you to other locations from where you can then either take the electricity or where you can bring it because you have more than what you need. Other good reasons for grids. Very often, the places where you have most renewables are actually not the places where you need most electricity. The easiest example of this is offshore wind farms, which have the best wind locations in Europe are actually in our seas, but there is very little consumption of electricity in the seas. You need a grid to transport it to where it's needed. And from an economical perspective, generally it's easier to find the sites and pay for the sites to put up renewable installations in the middle of nowhere than in the middle of human settlements. I do not want to say that generation at a smaller scale, we call it decentralized generation, closer to where people live, is not part of our energy future. It's an important part, especially also from the perspective of people buy it. But at the same point in time, given we need pretty much all the solutions that we have, there is going to be larger plants which are going to be far away from where people actually consume the electricity, and the connection is being done via grid. So overall, grids are fundamental to A, balance out variability, and also B, to make best use of the electricity then you can generate with each different site. And this is why, first message, if you want to think about really high shares of renewables, you need to think about infrastructure and especially grids. Let's move on to the second message, which is about scenario development and the importance of scenarios to be ambitious and also to have collaborative exercises of many stakeholders in developing them. The ambitiousness, it's one sentence, what we have ahead of us has to be ambitious. Why does it have to be a collaborative exercise of many? To start with, what you see here is in 4 simple steps how you determine the investment needs for new infrastructure. What you see at the very end on the right, the grid model, is what spits you out where you need to put the money for new infrastructure. But where does this start? Usually, you begin with a so-called storyline, which describes in a qualitative way what type of generation and what type of consumption you expect at a certain point in time in the future, 10, 15, 20, 30 years away from now. And this qualitative storyline is then converted into figures that describe when and where supply is going to be, when and where demand is going to happen, at which costs, how efficient different technologies are, this type of thing. This data, these figures, are then fed into a so-called market model. I'm evidently simplifying, excuses to all the modelers in the audience, but to bring the message across, this should be sufficient. So you have a market model which says, okay, what is the most cost optimal, the best cost optimal way to bring supply and demand together? And the market model does this without caring whether there is actually a transport way between generation and demand. This is what the grid model then does as the last step. It says, okay, if the market suggests this should be the generation sites that run, and this is where the supply is, do we actually have the infrastructure to bring the electricity from where it's being generated to where it's being used? And this grid model then also identifies the bottlenecks and says, actually here we need a new power line, because if we want to connect this supply and demand, we need to build the transport way. Now, next slide, please. I said in the development of scenarios, many different stakeholders should be involved. Why is that? Because the ambitious scenarios we need to think about to meet the Paris targets has to actually consider many, many different components that, to do so in a proper way, requires many different types of proficiencies. And I've put here some of them. This is not claiming to be a comprehensive list, but it gives you an idea of all the different questions that you need to consider when building a scenario. For example, mobility. How are we going to travel? How are we going to move a normal life and daily life in the future? what type of buildings are we going to use? How efficient, how smart are they going to be? What happens to our industrial processes? Is there going to be new chemical processes for heavy industry? Is there perhaps going to be some type of electrification also for this? New technologies, are they going to be as efficient as we assume? Are they actually desirable? Do we trust them that they are sustainable as people may claim they will be? Where will the energy we use come from? Will we generate it domestically? Will we import it from our neighbors? Will we bring it from a different continent? To which extent can we rely on biomass? Can we calculate in negative emissions to meet the targets? And on and on and on and on. And some of this, most of this is not the core expertise of those who traditionally build scenarios, so they need to engage with others to get plausible assumptions into their scenarios and develop scenarios that are really a useful basis for information. Next slide, please. There is no scenario that precisely describes what the future is going to be, but you want to have good scenarios to understand what the implications of one pathway or another are. And the reason why you want to have good scenarios are manifold. One is that if you build in the end, you want to make sure that you have a plausible story why you build something to increase the legitimacy for this infrastructure. I come to this point once more later on. Scenarios are important to give certainty to investors who need to decide where to put their money. They are important to give certainty to society who do not want to have stranded investments to pay for or a fossil lock-in in a situation where actually we want to meet climate targets. There is an interest to not overbuild also for consideration of all the space and natural resources this uses up. Every infrastructure has an impact on nature and uses space. Market and regulatory frameworks need to be adjusted to allow to move in the direction of certain scenarios, but of course you want to understand in which direction you are actually moving. For many new generation types, it's still about providing a level playing field. And again, from the perspective of those who have to build grids, a scenario, of course, helps to make sure that you don't build something that is taking forever, and by the time you actually have built it, it turns out it wasn't needed, the very long time of realization. So this is why it's important to work with ambitious scenarios and to involve a wide variety of stakeholders in building those. Next slide and third message. Why is civil society involvement so important in this? Next slide, please. These are photographs from Europe. I've heard from people who do not live in Europe that the situation can become quite comparable in other places of the world. You propose to build a power line, one of those big overhead line structures, and you certainly trigger opposition. And you need to deal with this opposition. We have, next slide please, observed over the years that when people oppose to power lines, there's taken some sort of learning has taken place. I would say 12 years ago, perhaps, when I started to deal with this topic, what people that felt affected or by a power line project and wanted to oppose it, the questions they would ask went into the direction of, can this not be built somewhere else? Could it perhaps be put underground? Or if we save more energy, can we avoid building this at all? Today, more people ask a different type of questions. Do we actually need this if the system as such was smarter? Would we need it if we did proper sector coupling? Is it really necessary if we have more storage? Can we avoid this if we build a really decentralized system? And the answers to all these questions has to come out of scenarios. Next slide, please. Which means that if you don't take into account these questions in the development of a storyline and scenario, by the time you get to the identified infrastructure needs, people will say, sorry, it's not plausible for me that this is really needed for the energy future that I think we should be living in. And because of this, the NGO partners that have been with RGI from the very beginning, told the TSO partners within RGI, guys, you need to look into more ambitious scenarios, which is not something that they would do from one day to another. But they do increasingly, individual TSOs do increasingly look into more ambitious scenarios. And also the scenario development that is done at the European level is moving more in this direction. And I come to my last slide, which is a brief introduction. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. To the umbrella under which also this event here takes place. Duncan mentioned this. This is the PAC project, Paris Agreement Compatible Scenarios for Energy Infrastructure, where since last year, RAIN 21, my organization, Renewables Grid Initiative, and two of the big European NGO umbrella organizations, the European Environmental Bureau and the Climate Action Network Europe, have been looking specifically into scenarios for Europe. On the one side, engaging with what is called the European Networks for Transmission System Operators. There's one for gas, there's one for electricity. For the electricity one, there's going to be a presentation later on. To engage in a solid conversation with them about whether their scenarios are ambitious enough. They develop and model scenarios every second year as part of a process which is called 10-year network development process. To tell them what from the civil society perspective would be likely and desirable futures that should be reflected in these scenarios. But also can Europe and the European Environmental Bureau seize the opportunity to develop their own scenario, to provide an input which is supported by civil society. There's going to be a presentation on this in a little while. We also wanted to learn how we can collaborate as a multi-stakeholder network on scenario development. We are doing this with this same project, and we wanted to raise a bit of global awareness, which is what we are doing here today. And this is where I leave you. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the further presentations and the discussions. Have a good afternoon or morning, wherever you are.
Thank you for that, Antina. It's funny to think about how people are spread out over the world in this event, we hope. And so to this fifth point of these core tasks of the PAC product, indeed, this event is focusing on this one with global awareness. Your presentation is excellent and really lays out the key questions quite well. We have no questions coming from the audience, so I'd like to ask you one myself. And this question is, it's regarding the quality of the questions that you've been receiving from your NGO members. Let's say the ones that are moving from the more conventional questions to the more modern type of questions, as you showed on that one slide. I'm wondering, for international audience, for people who may not have such an established organization like the Renewables Grid Initiative to work with them on this topic, how do you encourage civil society to start asking these type of questions, to move forward in that direction?
I think you really, when there's nothing there, you have to take a deep breath and start knocking on doors and raising your voice and just repeating the message that this is important again and again and again and again. When RGI started in 2009, I wasn't around, but our founder says that one of the founding members, who was the head of WWF International back then, said, "For me, grids are about as exciting as watching paint dry." So also when RGI started these many years ago, the first step was to recognize the importance of the topic as such. If you recognize this by yourself, you are perhaps a bit alone. If you partner up with others and say, I know this is fundamental and I want someone to talk to me about this, slowly things start to happen. It's a bit of perhaps a chicken and egg problem, but also chicken and egg solution. Yeah, to a certain extent, you can decide that if you want to talk about this, at some point in time, someone is going to react to this because they have to. And if you perceive that there is not enough of this going on in your context, in a way, you have to be the one to decide that you make something going on. It's barely a type of engagement that is going to be delivered to you upon a silver plate. It's something that you need to ask for.
Thanks for that answer. We're hopeful that people in the audience are listening to this and understanding what opportunities exist to get involved and the importance of becoming involved, and the fact that the relationship of civil society regarding grid planning can change over time. And in some cases, I mean, it's up to the individuals, the groups to take the action into their own hands in their own local context. So we'll continue working on that, and that actually leads us quite nicely to the next presentation, because we would like to share some success stories for engaging civil society in our PAC project. And without further ado, I would turn it over to Wendell Trio, the director of CAN Europe, and Patrick ten Brink from the European Environmental Bureau, to tell us all about what we've been doing in the PAC project for the last 2 years, what they've been doing, really.
Thank you, Duncan. So my name is Wendell Trio, and I'll start this presentation, and then I hand over to Patrick for the second part of this presentation. Just to start, 2 words about Climate Action Network Europe, CAN Europe. We're an umbrella organization bringing together over 170 NGOs working in Europe, specifically focusing on climate change and climate and energy policies. Patrick is from the European Environmental Bureau, that has a similar amount of membership, but that focuses on the broader environmental issues, including climate change. So we are compatible in terms of our actions. Can you go to the next slide? Patrick and me divide the work, and so we'll talk about first the process that we've engaged in developing this, what is called the PAC scenario, Paris Agreement compatible scenario, how we've engaged also in the TYNDP process, 10-year network development plans. We'll then give a little bit of an insight into what is actually that scenario, what are the results, what are the policies that need to accompany it, and then the next steps that we're looking at in terms of the further work around PAC. Next slide. So when we as NGOs think about energy infrastructure, we always start from the premise that we are in support of the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement, almost 5 years old, as you know, was concluded in December 2015, and has amongst its objectives that countries will make efforts to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And that is for us an incredible important objective, because we know that going well beyond 1.5 degrees of warming will lead to devastating and irreversible results. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change now at a warming of 1.1 degrees, but definitely going beyond 1.5 will bring a lot of misery. Unfortunately, with the current pledges that countries have made at the national level, we're likely going towards a scenario of 3 degrees. So much more action is needed. And that's also the starting point from which we developed our scenarios. As NGOs, we're calling upon the European Union to become climate neutral by 2040 rather than 2050. We're calling upon the EU to get 100% renewables by the same date, and for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 65% by 2030. And of course, then we get challenged by those in power that ask us, and how do you want to achieve that? How do you think that you can develop an energy transition that matches those criteria? And that's the challenge that we took upon us, and that we also used as part of our input into the development of the TYNDPs by the European transmission system operators. Can you go to the next slide? And so we started a process where we involved our broad membership, Both of our networks have a large membership base with a lot of expertise. So there is expertise in civil society, and we also involved experts, research institutes, and other organizations that have additional information to work with. We organized 5 workshops where we brought these experts together and combined that with webinars and online communication and so on to actually come to a decent approach where we looked at different studies and models and how they could kind of contribute to one coherent, consistent scenario. Next slide, please. And to do that, we kind of looked at what is the energy demand that we would need for each sector and for the different for the whole energy system as a whole. We looked at what is the different contributions that can be made from renewable energy sources, electricity and others that could match with the demand. And then we brought that together into a global model that looked at what does that mean for emission reductions, etc., and had it modeled on an hourly modeling by the ECO Institute. And as said, please next slide, we used a lot of different sources to do so. On the energy consumption part, we made use of the extensive work that has been done by the Fraunhofer Institute. For the renewables part, we looked at Energy Watch Europe's 100% renewable scenario developed by the Lund University in Finland. For the industrial transformation, we looked at the material economics report from the London School of Economics. For the funding part, we looked at the Berlin University's study on how the recovery funds can be used to transition Europe and so on. So we looked at all these different studies and brought them together and ensured that all were kind of in line with each other. And then we had this approved by our broad membership in Europe. Next slide. So in what we did, we kind of looked at how do we see our own scenario, and then try to convince the TYNDP, well, the NSOEs, the ENSOs, ENSOG and ENSOE, to integrate kind of that scenario or a similar scenario into their TYNDPs. That hasn't been successful yet, but still there are quite a number of elements of the work that we have been doing as NGOs that have improved the participation of civil society in the infrastructure planning as it happens in Europe. First of all, I think that our work did increase the participation of NGOs in the regular consultation processes of the ENSOs. Secondly, our work did include or increase the debate inside the ENSOs about what kind of a Paris-compatible scenario, future-looking scenario, taking into account kind of climate constraints would really mean, including the concept of working with carbon budgets, although we still have discussions about what the size of those budgets would be for Europe. But secondly, we also believe that we brought infrastructure and infrastructure planning into the debate of a broad range of NGOs in Europe, but still this doesn't mean that infrastructure planning is now the first priority. And of course, resource constraints make it often not so easy for NGOs to make infrastructure a priority in their work. And that is something that we definitely will continue to work on. Thank you. And I now would like to give the floor to Patrick.
Okay, thank you very much, Vendel. Yeah. I'm Patrick Tembrink, I'm the EU Policy Director of the European Environmental Bureau. And I think this is, I actually find this subject super interesting because my first job when I started was actually on electricity modeling in the UK and scenario development. So it's good to see that this issue is still so vibrant now and how it makes a difference. So we thought that in addition to talking around, the process of how we came to this scenario, we thought we'd actually share you with some of the results. So I've got a few slides on the results and then a bit on the way forward. So first of all, this is our picture from 2015 to 2050 of the energy demand. So you see naturally a reduction across all areas. So this is based on all the various different scenarios and inputs that and models that Wendell was talking about, but of course there's, demand reductions, energy efficiency measures, efficiency gains, eco-innovation, eco-design, all of it pushing down. And we think this is the way to reach the minus 65, a good chunk of the way of reaching the minus 65 target. Next, please. Yeah, okay. So then the question is, okay, what does it mean in terms of fuel? So naturally, that we're stepping out of coal, going beyond the fossil fuels, and our vision of the future is very much an electric future. We've got a bit of renewable hydrogen. We feel that there's a lot of discussions nowadays about hydrogen. There's a lot of excitement in the European context on hydrogen, but we feel because of the transformation losses that we see this very much focused on certain activities and certain sectors, but that electricity would actually be much more cost effective as a solution. So that's why we have a high level of electricity. Bioenergy plays a smaller role because we, as a civil society, we recognized the range of different impacts on biodiversity and land use and so on. And even some of the climate change aspects are not very convincing. So basically we have a strong electricity focus, some heat pumps, a little bit of renewable hydrogen and so on. We also don't have nuclear or carbon capture and storage by 2050 because, again, we feel there's technological risks, environmental risks, but also if you look at the economics of each of these, it doesn't make as much sense as the alternatives. Next slide, please. If you then say, okay, what are these alternatives to these? Well, I mean, it's primary wind onshore and offshore and solar PV. Of course, there's some space for hydro and geothermal. And this is then the vision as to our renewables future. This is on the electricity generation picture, by the way, not the whole issue. So the next slide. And then, of course, people say, well, if you have 100% renewables grid, how can you keep the lights on? So here, there's a range of different things we're looking at. Of course, you've got the grid extension, so everything is more connected, so you can import and export. You've got a wide range of storage facilities, whether it's batteries, pumped hydro, renewable hydrogen, synthetic methane, or there's also capacitors. You've got a range of demand side responses to manage the peaks and the troughs. And then if all fails, you still can have some fossil fuel plant available if ever needed. Next slide, please. So we looked at all of this and we've put all the numbers together and we feel it does work. And as Wendell said, we've done some modeling with the Oko Institute. But the question now is not only does it work, but how can we make it happen? So next slide, please. Okay, what do we need to make it happen? But next slide. Okay, so the first thing is we need to, of course, put money where your mouth is, or money where that matters. In the European context, we've got a major effort in responding to the COVID crisis. So there's a recovery package and there's the MFF. There's a huge discussion as to what share there should be of sort of Green Deal type and Paris compatible type investments. There's something called the taxonomy we're using to try to differentiate between good and bad practice to help also remove harmful subsidies. We've got what's called PCIs, which is a sort of a list of projects of community interest. These should hopefully be all Paris compatible. And the big fight is, of course, that some people will try to put gas and other things in there. We also need to act now and use each window of opportunity. So as mentioned, you have the funding ones. With the expected expansion of offshore wind, we need a strategy. So there's a offshore wind strategy being developed, and it's quite key not just to put the wind turbines anywhere, but if they shouldn't be in marine protected areas and so on. And then within the European context, there's something called the Fit for 55 package, which combines the review of the energy efficiency regulation, the renewables regulation, the emissions trading scheme, the burden sharing agreements, etc., etc. Ultimately, of course, we need to stop funding the fossil fuels and do that immediately because that's just going to lock in emissions into the future. So that's why Wendell and ourselves and other organizations are pushing hard that the recovery package and MFF have as less funding, as least funding as possible for fossil. But also we need to highlight certain risks because at the moment there's quite a lot of excitement hydrogen, and we see there's a number of risks around that, especially because it may lead to investments in gas infrastructure on sort of a false argument basis. And similarly, CCS is something which we feel is a technology which doesn't make that much economic sense, and it'll just be a way of supporting fossil fuels, but leading to a double money. Then you need to make the economy part of the solution. So Adam Smith's invisible hand pushes the economy in the right direction. As everyone knows, the economy has led to the crisis, the climate crisis. So we need to get better pricing, carbon taxes, subsidy reform, ETS reform there. That's, of course, in different countries are doing quite a lot all over the world, but there's a lot that needs to be done. And then, of course, we need to engage all the stakeholders to make a difference. So this is the policymakers on one level, the NSOs and CSOs and so on. And the question is, how can each of us work together to allow us to push forward a sort of an ambitious agenda? And we're developing a policy brief, which we would have been able to circulate today. But one of my colleagues has had COVID. He's all right, but it's sort of delayed us, but we'll share that afterwards. And then two more slides, just to have a nice pretty slide that this is a picture of all the windows of opportunity to engage. So what we're trying to do is to take the results of our carbon neutral scenario, PAC scenario, into the various different windows of opportunity. So there's discussions on state aids, there's the emissions trading, there's trans-European network discussions, et cetera. So each of those are windows of opportunity to engage with different set of stakeholders to say, listen, this is our vision. We've got an open source in terms of our data, have a look at it, see how this evidence contributes to your reflections as to what should be appropriate policies. Next slide. So there are many different ones. I'm quite curious as to what the big windows of opportunity are in your country. And the next slide. So what are the next steps? Well, we finished this scenario, it's complete, but and as Wendell said, we've been engaging the TYDP process, but it's not the end of the discussion. So we want to continue discussing in the TYDP process and with various organizations to say, listen, we'll give you all the numbers, you can play with them, you can test them, you can tweak them, you can see how they fit, and maybe you can then pick up our scenarios in due course. We, of course, need to make use of all these policy windows and opportunity, and they can be big ones and small ones. And some can be just like identifying sort of regional planning or local planning issues that are blockages to the development of the grid, and other can be sort of multi-billion investment opportunities. We also want to deepen the scenario and sort of, because one thing is the European level, but a lot of the action is by national investments, national decisions. So we're trying to see if we can get additional grants to help look at sort of national level information engagement. And of course, we've done some things right, we may have done some things wrong, so we want to share what we've done in terms of how civil society can engage with different stakeholders in this, and also learn from what people are doing across the world, because maybe you guys have come up with some solutions that we've not thought of. So we're always all ears to learn about how we can most effectively engage, so that we can then nudge the sort of scenario planning and investments in the direction towards a 1.5 degree world. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I hope that's been interesting.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you, Wendell, as well, for sharing both the development process of this scenario and the key outcomes of the scenario itself with us. We have one question coming in from the audience, and it's a bit of an insider question from one of us from RGI. We're wondering whether you think that the PAC scenario has landed well, whether it's been well received, or if the calls for more ambitious planning have been listened to, and what your thinking is on the impact of the ENSOs and their 2022 storylines that have just been released for public consultation. To what extent the development of the scenario is being worked into this process.
I'll start with the easy bit of the answer, and I'll give the difficult bit to Wendell afterwards, if I may. So I'll start with the easy bit. The easy bit is that we've actually had a positive response from a wide range of stakeholders saying it's great that there is an actual 100% renewables scenario. It's been missing, and it's also great that there's numbers, and we're happy to share the numbers with people. So that's the easy bit. So that's been the positive reception. And in terms of the details to how it's engaged and linked to the TYNDP and the ENSOs, I'll leave Vendel because he's more expert than me on that bit.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I would agree that in general, the reception has been very positive in the sense that it's also a challenging scenario. So it kind of looks at where can we go to the boundaries, and that helps scenario builders, modelers, etc. In their thinking. I think that's also what we did with the TSOs, but of course, Dante Powell speaks later on, so he can better reflect on the question, how it has been received. But as I said before, the scenario has not been copied by the ENSOs, that we haven't gone that far, but I do believe that it has definitely led to some thinking, both in the group that deals with the TYNDP process, but also in individual TSOs that are seeing that there are other approaches that might be useful.
Thanks very much. We are running a few minutes behind time, so I'll just thank you both again for this great presentation and lead us into the next block of this event today. As discussed, as promised at the beginning, we have 3 interesting case studies to share with you. We had a session this morning where we had some presentations from Australia, from Japan, and also from Europe. The Australian presentation, obviously it's about the middle of the night in Sydney at the moment, so our colleague Natasha couldn't be with us in this afternoon session, but we did record it. So we thought actually, instead of just me reading the slides to you, it would be a bit more of an interesting exercise to play this presentation, which was really well delivered and super interesting in what they're doing with their integrated system plan. So I'll leave you with the video with Natasha, and you can take a look at how we looked this morning as well in the first session of this event.
Thanks very much, Sven. Just wanted to confirm that you can hear me okay. Great. So could I have the next slide, please, Duncan? Good morning to everybody, and I am delighted to be speaking to you from Australia. As Ben has introduced me, my name is Natasha Sinclair, and I work for the Australian Energy Market Operator. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the role of the electricity grid in the energy transition and how civil society can help drive that energy transition by being involved in the planning process. Next slide, please. So the national electricity market here covers the 5 eastern states of Australia and our Australian Capital Territory. Just a few facts and figures here, which Sven has helped to set the scene a little bit. The NEM, as it's known, incorporates around 40,000 kilometres of transmission lines and cables, and it supplies about 200 terawatt hours of electricity each year to 10 million customers, so somewhat small in comparison to the European market. AEMO's role is that we are the operator of the NEM, and we also carry out the long-term planning to maintain reliable and secure operation. Now, as part of that planning role, we are required to publish a document every 2 years, which is called the Integrated System Plan. And this is a whole of system plan for the NEM that helps to inform decision makers who are looking at future policy and also investments and regulatory and market reform. And the guiding objective of the ISP, the Integrated System Plan, is to achieve our power system needs of reliability and security at the lowest cost to consumers, while also meeting our policy objectives. Next slide, please. So you will have heard of the energy transition, which is what we're discussing today, and this is happening on many levels across many different industries. So in the electricity business, we are seeing a transition away from coal to increase levels of renewable energy from wind, solar and hydro. And this has been happening for a number of years now here in Australia, similarly to in Europe. And this graph shows our forecast energy mix over the next 20 years. So starting from now in 2020 and looking forward, you can see that the black bars at the very bottom, which represents black coal, is starting to decline, and that is occurring as our aging coal-fired power stations are going to be retired by their operators. And you see that we have in its place an increase in both variable renewable energy from wind and solar, and also dispatchable storage that is going to be required to help us to be able to operate the system safely and securely over that time. So this is really just showing the scale of the change that we're expecting to see over the next 20 years. Next slide, please. So as part of the work for the integrated system plan, we have a number of aspects that we need to consider, such as emissions reductions plans and policies. We look at forecasts for economic growth, market reforms that might be required to help us to maintain the grid during the transition, and also consumer investment that's happening in distributed energy resources over that time. And again, just to give you a feel for some of the figures, the changes that we're expecting to see through the next 20 years are up to 15 gigawatts of coal retiring, an increase in distributed energy, such as rooftop solar, of 200%, new variable renewable energy, wind and solar of around 26 gigawatts, and also along with those, the dispatchable resources that are required, anywhere up to 19 gigawatts. Next slide, please. So the integrated system plan produces as its result a plan which we call the optimal development path. And so what you can see here is the eastern side of Australia, and it has in a number of different colours. Each of these lines that you see is a new transmission project that is planned and forecast over these next 20 years. The ISP is important from a network planning perspective because it's really the first stage for many of these network upgrades to be assessed. And it really sets the rules from here as to how the transmission companies will be able to then justify the various individual components of the overall plan. So there's a traffic light system that we use here, going from the green projects, which are called actionable and will be developed over the next 5 to 10 years, through to orange, where we are looking to do a little bit more work and design, which we call preparatory activities before the final investment decisions are made. And the red, which are future projects that are being considered but are not yet required until a later date. And so what you can see overall is that due to the increase in renewables that we're expecting with more wind and more solar, we're going to be needing to have a lot more interconnection across the country to make sure that we can bring all of those, the energy from the VRE into the cities and the major load centres. And also referring back to Antina's presentation, to ensure that we have the diversity and we can make the most of the diversity that we have being spread over such a large geographical area. So if the sun is shining in one part of the country where it's not in the other, we can shift the energy around using the grid, and that's why it's so important. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to talk a bit more about how civil society can help to drive this transition. And moving on, next slide, thanks. So with the ISP, which, as I mentioned earlier, runs every 2 years, is produced every 2 years, we have quite a significant program of stakeholder consultation across that period of time. And the slide that you can see here is showing the various engagement opportunities that we had over the last 2 years before the 2020 ISP was published just in July, just gone. You can see here that the various different icons represent publications, which are shown in the red, and workshops, which are shown in the blue, as well as some various webinars that were held along the way, and also updates that were issued regularly to make sure that people could keep up with the progress of the planning. So the process initially started out with consultation on scenarios, inputs and assumptions. And you've heard a couple of the speakers earlier talking about scenarios. And similarly, we in Australia use up to 5 scenarios in our planning process. And we had significant consultation where the result of one or 2 of those sessions was that another additional scenario was included quite early on in the piece to really make it a little bit more ambitious and take that further step out in terms of emissions reduction. So that was a positive outcome from the involvement of our stakeholders. And you can see that we held in early 2020 a series of 3 workshops over a couple of days across different capital cities in Australia, which allowed people to provide commentary on our draft integrated system plan, which we then took on board. And we actually asked for people's feedback in terms of what would be the priority of different modelling work that they would like to see included in the final few months of modelling before the final ISP was produced in July. Next slide, please. So early on in the ISP process, we held a workshop to help us to identify the best locations for what we called candidate renewable energy zones, or REZs. We started with the resource maps such as these, looking at wind and solar across the country, and we asked people to help us to define the criteria that could be used to define and rate the potential areas for siting clusters of renewable energy generation. Next slide. So the result of this process was that 10 factors were selected, including resource quality, land cover, and others that you can see here. And the resulting weighted maps were then used to define up to 35 candidate renewable energy zones that you can see in the map on the right. And these candidate zones were used as inputs for our ISP modelling. A large number of these were then actually selected and became part of that optimal development path that I showed you earlier with the grid plan overlaid. And you can see that each of the circles here represents a proposed renewable energy zone, which is a mix of solar and wind. So we're very fortunate here to have such strong quality resources. Next slide. So as I mentioned, after the draft ISP was issued, we did have workshops with a large range of stakeholders, and we really encourage people from a variety of backgrounds to be involved. This included generators, network service providers, retailers, government, consumer groups, and civil society groups. And we took the feedback that we received from these workshops, and our management team then had weekly meetings where we stepped through many hundreds of suggestions that were received during these workshops and filtered those through so that we could apply them as best as possible in the modelling work. Next slide, and last one. So in conclusion, AEMO really encourages all stakeholders from many different backgrounds to be involved in the ISP planning process. And in order to do that, probably the best place for people to start, if people are interested to find out more, is on our website. And I've included a link here where we try to publish as much of the information as possible for the integrated system plan. And we are already now starting on our next 2-year cycle with consultation for the 2022 ISP. And so we're looking forward to, again, having involvement along the way. So I'll hand it back to Sven. Thank you very much.
So there you have a recording of our presentation from Natasha Sinclair, Energy Systems Lead from the Australian Energy Market Operator this morning. Quite interesting what they're doing with their integrated system plan. She's not here, so we can't ask her any questions, but we are happy to receive questions. If you have them in the chat, we'll take them and we'll forward them on to AMO, and then we'll post them on our website with the recordings and the slides of these presentations in the next few days. So please let us know. In the meantime, I would like to move on to another part of the world, another warm part of the world, and we're happy to welcome two colleagues from the academic world of Chile. And I'm just going to open this here. I'd like to welcome Enzo Salma Santos from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, and Sebastian Jesus Oliva Enriquez from the Metropolitan University of Technology, who will tell us about the Chilean perspective when it comes to grid planning and stakeholder engagement. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Duncan, for the invitation. It's an honor to present here about the Chilean experience. So on the first part, the next, please. I'm going to talk about the transmission planning process in Chile, the next one. So this is a new process for us because there was a change in the law on 2016 that defined the whole process of the transmission planning. So all this process that I'm going to mention here is relatively new for us. It's only working in Chile since 2017 was the first year that was applied. And basically start with the long-term energy planning process that was new for Chile, which basically is led by the Minister of Energy and is looking at 30 years horizon and is trying mainly to see what are the areas, the zones where you can have a lot of potential from renewable and you can exploit it. Similar to the concept that Natasha was explaining in Australia for the renewable energy zones. Well, basically it's the same here that in Chile we call poles. So these poles are these areas where there is a lot of potential for renewable and that could be exploited in the next years. So since in our system, all the investment in generation are private, basically these poles are just a recognition that there is a lot of potential in an area. And then that's an input for the transmission planning process. So this process, this long-term energy planning process, which is every 5 years, is basically a seek for zones where you can develop renewable, and that process had a lot of participation from the community, from the indigenous community, and have several workshops of participation with people. So then when you have all this input and you have these potential poles or these potential areas of renewable, that's an input for the coordinator, which is the national operator of the power system in Chile, and the National Energy Commission, because they are the one that run the transmission planning process that is running every year. So every year, the coordinator and the National Energy Commission run this transmission planning process. They look at 20 years horizon, and that start by the coordinator running several software optimization software to try to optimize or minimizing the cost of finding the optimal transmission and generation expansion for the next 20 years from a central point of view, and looking at the potential poles defined in the energy planning process. Then the coordinator send these optimal plans to the National Energy Commission, which is called CNAE there. And also some market agents can propose new lines. So all this input is taken by the National Energy Commission to try to see what are the optimal transmission lines to be planned in the next 20 years. Then this is subject to questions about the participation in the community, and if there's some discrepancies, then there is an expert panel that resolve these discrepancies. And then if there's no more discrepancies, then the National Energy Commission is going to enact a decree with all the transmission lines that are going to be built in the next 5 years. So at that moment, there is the option for the Ministry of Energy to ask some of those lines to have a stripe study, which Sebastian is going to explain more in detail. If there's no striped study, which happened until last year, then the National Energy Commission simply runs some tender process for build the transmission lines, and then the process ends. The next slide explains just a little bit about how this process of the coordinator is done. So next slide, please. So basically, the coordinator, the system operator, start solving the transmission and generation joint central optimal planning, trying to solve the minimum cost optimization problem, and then define the optimal plan or the optimal expansion in transmission and in generation. But in order to look at this 20 years horizon, the model is relatively simple, have no technical constraint, for example, ramp up or ramp down constraint, or shut down or startup costs of the unit. So then the second stage is that they run a one node optimization with all these technical constraints about the ramp up, ramp down requirements from renewable, to see how the potential of renewable can be done, how the constraint imposed by those renewable. Then in the third stage, they evaluate if these requirements put a stress on the transmission expansion that they already have. And then in a fourth stage, they try to have a robust planning transmission tool, incorporating or increasing the capacity in order to allow that this technical stress constraint to allow renewable are solved. So then they have like a more robust or with more capacity transmission planning tools. And all this process is then sent to the National Energy Commission to decide the optimal plan. So next, Sebastian is going to explain one very important step that I mentioned, which is the STRIPE study that is going to start this year. So next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. Next slide, please. Well, we have a new process for the participation of the civil society and the grid planning. And next, please. But first, some general context. Last week, we had a plebiscite for a new constitution with an 80% of support. And this is the result of a number of protests against the extreme free market system that we have, with a lot of violence and deaths. And there you see in the pictures, one protest with more than 1 million people in the streets of Santiago. So this is really showing that there is a drive for the civil society to take part of the decision making in the country. And in terms of energy and grids, the goals are first to be considered in the process, transparency, not having black boxes or decisions made only by a small group of people. And this is what this new process is trying to achieve. Because of the shape of the country, we have long distances and many stakeholders and negotiations for the land use rights for building the power lines. So this is a long process. And the result of all this is that today we don't have enough transmission system to use the renewable energy potential that we have. Just last month, we had a record of curtailed renewable energy in Chile. So next, please. I wanted just to flag here an example of something that really didn't work a few years ago. This is the Hydro Haisen project, a mega energy project in Chile, in the south of Chile, of 2.7 hydropower plants that were going to bring energy from the southern part of Chile to the load centers in Santiago City and the north. And that was going to be done with a 3,000 kilometers power line. The decision here was done by a commission of 11 people. And of course, then there were protests and 74% of opposition in different polls. And at the end was canceled. So that was something that it really didn't work. The environmental and social risks were just too high. So next slide, please. So now we have a new system, the STRIPE study, and this requires the participation of the civil society. And before, what happened is that the transmission company decided the power line stripes, and there was an environmental study for the specific project that was going to be built. So now from 2016, now the Chilean state decides the stripes based on a strategic environmental evaluation. And this strategy tries to find a balance between the technical, the economics, the social and the environmental dimensions of the problem. It's more like the assessment of a program rather than just a specific project. And it is proactive, it's a big picture, and it requires the participation of the civil society and indigenous communities if they are involved. So the goals of this STRIPE study is first to have a strategic intervention of the territory based on this balance, and have early acceptability so we avoid things like the example that I gave with cancellations in the last minute. And the process of this study is shown in the picture. First, there is we take a big piece of land where we have to decide based on this balance the different corridors and stripes that are the best options. And in all this process, there are always input from the civil society. So at the end, the Minister of Energy decides one best option. It's sent to a sustainability commission, and then if it is approved, the regular process comes on the construction. So just to finish here, this is a proactive system, new system that can give continuity and acceptability, something that is very important in Chile, and it may be not good for quick solutions, and it requires to coordinate many institutions to build this strategy, which are very bureaucratic. So I'm open to questions later. Thanks.
Thank you both of you. That's a very interesting approach in the STRIPE study. I would like to ask more. I don't think we have any questions coming in from the audience specific to this. And in the interest of time, we ran out a bit of time. We ran a bit out of time this morning, and our breakout room sessions were a little short. So I think I'll just move on, and we'll talk about this this specific case in the breakout rooms, and anybody who is interested in that can make their way to your room. So for the next presentation, I'd like to call on Dante Powell from ENSO-E, the European Network Transmission System Operators for Electricity, who's going to tell us about the 10-year network development program plan, which is TYNDP. So if you see the TYNDP on his slides a lot, and that's what it means. Tell us about this a little bit, the scenario and the stakeholder engagement. So I will hand it over to you, Dante, and I believe you need to share your screen. So I'll ask my colleague Leah to stop sharing hers. And Dante, you can share yours when you're ready.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my screen, are you able to see it?
Yes, it's just low. Yeah, we've got it.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, so yeah, just to start, maybe give a little bit of background about me. I know that time is fast spent, so I will try to be as quick as possible. But I work for ENSO-E, so that's the European Network for Transmission System Operators for Electricity. It's a mouthful, but essentially we are a network and association which brings together all of the TSOs in Europe, as well as the wider area. So we have, for example, observer members from Ukraine and Iceland, but we're quite far spread. Today, so Antina mentioned in her presentation, she went on, she spoke about scenarios and as the baseline for the TYNDP and the baseline for the infrastructure development. So I lead the scenario process at ENSO-E, and I want to give a little bit more insight into what we do for the scenarios and how we engage with stakeholders. So first, it's probably necessary to tell you what the TYNDP is. It's the 10-year network development plan. And essentially, it's a plan which looks at infrastructure in Europe. It looks at the development of the infrastructure for both electricity and gas projects, which then goes into another process, which is called the Projects of Common Interest, where the European Commission give funding for projects which are of European interest. So in all, they will lower the social economic welfare increase the social economic welfare in Europe, but lower system costs. And also looks at things like res integration, reduction in CO2 emissions, and things like this. So the scenarios are actually designed for this TYNDP process, and it looks at how energy will be developed in Europe, whether that's a centralized, decentralized version. How can we be sure that with this development of so much renewable, so much wind, so much solar, there's going to be quite a large reduction in thermal plant? How do we ensure that infrastructure is there to support this renewable development? We have different regulations in the EU. As of late, the discussion's been on the Green Deal, which looks to increase the European ambition. So do we fit into this Green Deal? Do we fit into the Green Deal development? And I guess that's making our way onto the COP21 Paris Agreement targets. And then, of course, very important for us is, can it deliver in terms of security of supply? Can the TSOs actually run the system based on the new generation mix and the infrastructure that's in place? So we do the scenarios for analyzing information. So it's not so much, we're not trying to predict, we're not trying to forecast, we're trying to look at what are the boundaries of the energy transition. And as a part of this analysis, we look at what is the requirement for grid and infrastructure. The European Commission have their own scenarios, and we kind of build these scenarios as well, which again is the base of these quite high profile projects. But we also try to make sure that we're in line with what the European Commission are looking at and planning. So why do we build the scenarios? Why do ENSO-E and ENSOC build the scenarios? Well, we have a huge development team. We have 90 gas and electricity TSOs consisting of 30 regions. We're committed to increasing EU social economic welfare. So what we do with scenarios is we try to cost optimize to ensure the best value for European citizens. We try to take in national relevance into account. So we combine the national commitments with EU targets, which can be a little bit different. For example, you have the energy and climate plans, but the national commitments may even go above this. So we try to take into account the latest energy and climate commitments from the TSOs. We try to innovate the scenarios. We have a lot of expertise inside. We, of course, operate the borders 24/7. And we're in quite a strategic place and quite a good place to ensure that we have quite an extensive stakeholder engagement. So in the previous process, we had 9 public workshops and consultations, and we had well over 200 stakeholders in most of the workshops. And the consultation, we get very good feedback from this as well. Working with RGI has been very, very beneficial in this as well, as they push some of the civil society actors to have a say in our consultation, which in turn allows us to implement, or at least try to implement, what the needs of the European society are looking at. So how exactly did we consider stakeholder feedback in the previous scenarios? So it's important to say that when you're looking at infrastructure development, the T1DP is very technical, and it's very methodological. So the bulk of the stakeholder engagement which happens in the process comes from the scenario building process, because our structure essentially allows us to take stakeholder feedback from multiple sectors. So whereas the T1DP look more at just electricity infrastructure, this is really what they do. We can say, okay, how are the sectors transforming? How is the transport sector? How is the industrial sector, the residential sector, tertiary? How is the heating sector transforming? And we can take feedback from a lot of different stakeholders. So the T1DP, as I say, it is a lot of technical analysis. They look at system needs, they perform project cost benefit analysis. And that project kind of requires more interaction with ACER, European Commission, project promoters, but the documents that they produce are consulted publicly. But whereas with the scenario building process, stakeholders are able to feed into the process before the scenarios are created. So you kind of come with us in the journey of creating the scenarios, which is really the beauty of having a good stakeholder engagement. And for anybody that is interested, I would recommend that this would be the good place to go. But essentially, in the end, the scenarios form the baseline and they determine what the infrastructure requirements will be. So we had some stakeholder engagement in the previous process. And what did we actually do in terms of adjusting our scenarios? What did stakeholders think? They thought they weren't diverse enough, bioenergy was overstated. They thought, the amount of gas in the scenarios was too high. They had comments on the demand, electrification, and also that, they rely quite heavily on different technologies such as hydrogen, CCS, biomethane, which may not be so proven. So we do take this into account, and we did update the scenarios, and we did try to bring that back into the feedback loop. So we updated our scenarios with the latest NECPs, so National Energy and Climate Plans. We reran the model to try to take into account the German coal phase out, which means that there's going to be more renewables, which then in turn means there's going to be more need for grid in the European space. We did a reduction in biomass. So, we consulted with NGOs and different actors, and they noticed that our biomass was quite high. So we shifted this down. we reduce the gas demand in 2050, at least in one of the scenarios. And there was a request for a lot more data. So we've made everything completely open, completely free. So it includes generation mix, demand, capacity mixes, the grid that has been developed in the European energy space to go with our scenarios, the gas data, and everything is open under an open data license. So anybody can use this and further complement this in your studies. And then we also improve explanations and benchmarks to address some concerns. So we do really try to take into account as much as possible stakeholder feedback, and it's quite important for us. We're starting the 2022 process now. So what are we looking at for stakeholder engagement in this process? So we do, every year we try to enhance our transparency and stakeholder engagement. We already had a workshop on the 3rd of July. Stakeholders, they were at the very start of the process, they were offered the opportunity to ask questions and get clarity on key issues relating to these scenarios. Up to now, so we started the process in July, we're in November now. We've already had, one-to-one engagements with 15 organizations from NGOs to DSOs, and we are planning to have even more engagement here. We are releasing a storyline report today for our storyline consultation. And actually in this consultation, we want to give hard data rather than just conceptual, this is what the methodology will be. So as you can see in the right side of the screen, this looks at the, let's say the boundary conditions of different studies in Europe to say, this is how much installed capacities you have for wind, solar, we have nuclear, we look at EVs, electric vehicles, we look at all these things. And we want stakeholders to come back to us and say, oh, maybe this solar, this isn't the max you should go to, maybe you can go to 1,600. We want to hear from stakeholders. We want your references, and we want to use this to really implement and build on the work that we're already doing in the scenarios. So this consultation is open to everyone, and we encourage you to have a look. Just go very quickly into the scenarios and talk a little bit more about the grid that we need. These are the scenarios: distributed energy, global ambition, national trends. You can see that we really try to move away from these fossil kind of fuels and really have a big uptake in wind and solar. And also up here, you see wind and solar, but this is for power to gas. In national trends, you see a similar thing. And in global ambition, a similar thing. And in national trends, you also see quite a big uptake of wind and solar, and also a little bit of hydro in there as well. It's important to say that the target that we're looking at for the top-down scenarios are the Paris Agreement targets. So we look at Paris Agreement to try to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, but we've already got feedback from, for example, the PAC project, who are looking at how do we achieve this by 2040. But this is what we did last year. So we need to, get some more feedback into our consultation, see what the civil society wants, see what people want. And then we can see what is the need if you're going to try and do this by, reach the targets by 2050, reach the target by 2040. We will build a scenario around this, and then out of that will come what is the requirements for grid. But it's not just the transmission grid that we need to look at. You can see that there's quite a big uptake in EVs and heat pumps that you can see, especially EVs, when you look at, for example, the distributed energy. And this is going to require real reinforcement in the distribution grids, as well as the transmission grids. So you need, and there'll also be a lot of renewables that are in the distribution grids as well. So the need for grids on the distribution level is also something that, we should be looking at, and that in the European space we should be assessing. The second is hydrogen grid. So we do have a large uptake of hydrogen in the scenarios. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to do a joint optimization that looks at the hydrogen grid, but it also looks at the electricity grid. So where can you find synergies between these two grids? And having development of one infrastructure will impact the development of the other infrastructure. So as was mentioned before, there is a roadmap for hydrogen in Europe for the European Commission. A lot of studies are working on hydrogen. So we are also trying to take this into account as well and see how this kind of sector coupling aspect of the European energy transition will affect the need for grids for electricity as well. That was my last slide. I'm sorry I may have went over a little bit, but I hand back over to you.
This is our second session of today. We've had great presentations from not only our case studies, but also our members of the PAC Consortium. So a big thank you to RGI, to CAN Europe, and to EEB, and then to all of our case study presenters from AMO, from ENSO-E, from our two universities in Chile, from TEPCO from this morning, and from AMO, I believe I said that already. So just a couple thoughts to close this. One of them is that we see that this discussion is just really fascinating. There are different experiences that are taking place all around the world with respect to this topic. Many people and more people are recognizing the importance of not only developing the grid, of course, but also making it collaborative. We just had a nice chat with I just had a nice chat with Dante about this as well, and there's expertise that does exist in civil society that is very valuable to the grid planners, that is very valuable to the scenario development process, and is not a matter of, you might think of it as a matter of people saying, well, why don't you be more ambitious? Why don't you take this into account? It's actually expertise that is really useful. So this is a message that's as the PAC Consortium, as REN 21 as well, we will continue to spread the importance that we need this infrastructure to develop renewable energy, to reach high shares, and that we want citizens to be involved. We want you to lend your expertise, to bring your experience and help develop these scenarios. We've tried to highlight a bit of this in our report. You can see it on the shared slide now, the shared screen now. We'll have that coming out in 2 weeks, where we're highlighting 5 different case studies that work on scenario development and grid planning. And we look at the level of stakeholder engagement, civil society engagement that takes place. And one of the most interesting findings is just that in some of these places, not only is there very little or no stakeholder engagement, but there's not even really an established grid planning process. So as I mentioned, we're really operating at different levels of complexity here, different levels of development, and there's different interesting messages that we can spread amongst our international community. So with that, I'll tell you to keep an eye out for our report, and I'll thank the speakers once again, and thank you to all the participants for taking part, for sending us your questions, for lending us your expertise as well. And we hope to keep engaging with you on this topic and other topics with PAC and REN 21, and we will see you in the near future. So have a nice evening, afternoon, morning, everyone, and see you next time.